Welcome to Stitch in Time. My name is Michael Lianos, and it's my job to make sewing approachable to the hobbyist. Today we're going to be working on sleeves. Wait a minute, this is the wrong project. Let me take out the right project. Much better, this is the project we're working on. Where do Russians keep their armies? Up their sleeveys. Get it? Army, sleeve, never mind. I'm bad at jokes. Let's dive into sewing. The next step in assembly is the placket, which is this piece that creates the opening on the sleeve. Now I've ironed, I've marked my stitching line, and I've pinned the placket to the sleeve where it's going to go. So we need to go up, over, and back for our next stitch. As I get closer to the corner, sometimes I need to adjust the stitch length just to get it precisely in the corner. Once the needle is down into the corner, the presser foot comes up. You rotate the cloth until it's facing the direction you need to now go. Then the presser foot comes back down. Then you stitch again. This one needs a little adjustment to the stitch length to get exactly in the corner, and there I am. Again, the presser foot comes up, you rotate the cloth, adjust your stitch length back to normal, then away you go. Now that we stitched our placket on, we can remove the pins and head to the ironing board. Now with the placket, we want to eventually bring both sides to the other side of the fabric. However, I start with bringing the shorter side and this little piece here to the other side. So how I do that is I first iron this piece flat. Then I flip the fabric over and I pull it through to the other side, pulling everything through. And I straighten things out, making sure this little tab lays flat. So then I come to the other side and I do just that little tab. And then I do this part. Now, when we bring this over and stitch it, we want to fold it in so that this side meets up with this side, and then we fold it over once. So, this little lip should go just a hair over this seam line. When I was first reading patterns and making shirts, I was pulling this all the way over, and then it was looking like it didn't match the pattern. So the best way to match the pattern is this seam here lies in like that and flat. You pull it in once, pull it in twice where it goes just past the seam, and then we're going to pin it and stitch right along here. See you at the sewing machine. I realized my fat fingers got in the way at the sewing machine, so I want to show and reiterate again. With this seam here, you want it to fold in once like that, where this side lines up with this side, and then you want to fold it over again, trying not to block it here so you can see, just so that this little lip goes ever so slightly past this stitch line. And then you pin and then stitch all along the edge here. Now when you have the top here, I wanted to point out there is some folding that happens up here. It's not straight and flat. It folds. So it doesn't quite line up at the top here. It folds over and there's some crinkle in there, and that's normal. As long as this little tab lays flat and everything is flat with the fold, then it won't show in the end. So let me pin. I always make sure the ends are cleaned up so that there are not any hairs coming out. Now to sew one line up. As you get closer to the top, you want the sleeve part to lie flat and this sort of out of your way. That way you get a nice, neat end. I usually hand stitch to the end, go slightly over, and then back stitch, and then back over, and we're done. Now I wanted to show you, we only did this one stitch all the way up. This is going to be another piece. And I wanted to show you the other side. See how this line goes just on the other side of that seam? It didn't quite right here, but it won't show on the other side, and that'll be fine. If you don't like that, you can rip the seam just along here. If you don't like something in sewing, a lot of times, especially with 100% cotton, 100% linen, some broadcloths out there, there are many different fabrics that will be forgiving and let you try again. So I can go with the machine, back stitch here, continue this line neatly, and then back stitch here, and then it'll be a-okay. All fixed. And the reason why I'm showing you some of these mistakes is to show you it's okay to make mistakes, especially on your first shirt. It's fine doing things like this and restitching and fixing it. I'm trying to give you the tools to feel comfortable sewing. So, our next step is to meld this seam in with the iron and then get this part of the placket prepared. So see you over at the ironing board. Here we are back at the ironing board, and we need to meld this stitch. Double check our little tab at the top. And then we need to flatten this. So I make sure to pull it nice and tight, and I just press this seam over. I don't catch the tab in this. Some plackets will be square like this one. Some plackets will have a little triangle at the top. Don't get scared, they work the same way. So my placket tells me that I have 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So I take 3/8 of an inch and fold it over. It's not a lot. It's a very small seam allowance. So I make sure to hold that flat, give it a nice press along, making sure it stays that 3/8 of an inch. So if you had the triangle, you would fold over this way and then proceed. Since I have a square, it's a little bit easier. Again, 3/8 of an inch, measure. Don't eyeball it unless you've had lots of experience sewing. And then this will come over and you want to stitch it just like the other side, ever so slightly on the other side of this. So if I can use this pointy ruler, right along there is where your stitch should be. So you pull it along, and then the other thing you want to make sure is that the top part, not necessarily the bottom part, that the top part covers the top part of this all the way until this little tab. So if that top part covers the small piece, and then it comes just on the other side of the seam, you did your placket right. So I'm going to go back to the sewing machine and stitch it, pin it and stitch it. Man, words are hard today. Alright, see you there. For pinning, I wanted to point out a few things. You may not be able to see this so well on the camera, but I pin right into the very edge of the corners. That way the fold over stays nice and tucked under, because sometimes those folds can come out and look sloppy. And that's the thing with your pinning jobs. Pinning and ironing are so important to making sure things go the way you want them to go once you get to your machine. So pin twice, sew once, or iron twice, sew once. It works similar to carpentry. Measure twice, cut once. Sewing machine on. Let's get this stitch rolling. Alright, now we're getting close to the pin at the corner. How I navigate this, which will help you out, is here's a secret. You don't have to pull the pin all the way out. Again, the pin doesn't have to come all the way out. It can come part way out. So I would take your finger and ever so slightly manipulate the pin so that the pointy part is just ever so slightly poking through, and you can see just the little end, just the tip. And you continue on. As you get closer to the tip, I then remove the tip but keep the other part of the needle inside the cloth. I don't pull it all the way out, and I hand do this part of the placket. As I'm approaching my needle, I then finally pull the needle the rest of the way out, because I know my presser foot is now holding that corner down. So I go all the way into where my needle was at the very edge of the corner. Now that I'm in that hole of where the needle was, I then have my needle down into the cloth. My presser foot then goes up. I rotate to grab the other corner. Now if you have a triangle, this works much the same way. It's just you're not turning quite as abruptly as this square corner, and the needle's the same thing. This needle end is all the way out. I want to pull it back ever so slightly. I'm not pulling the needle all the way out, just part way. I'm stitching right along the edge. As I get close to the needle end, I then pull the end back through where the needle is only sticking in its final hole. Continue on. As I get closer to my needle and my presser foot is holding the corner down, I then pull the pin out, hand stitch to the corner where my needle hole was, successfully in the needle hole, presser foot up, turn the corner again, and here we go. Before I get too far, you have to know where your little notch is. Sometimes you can actually see it through the cloth. This one, I can see it through the cloth. You can't see it on the camera per se. If you cannot see it, but you can feel it, I would take just a little bit of chalk and mark right where you're going to come down to. So where this, let me take my needle out. Maybe I can show you. Where this little tab is, where we ironed it down early on, you're going to sew this top part just on top of that tab. So you're not going to come past the tab, you're going to go just before the tab, and then you're going to go across. So let me continue down. Here we go, I'm right on the tab. I lift my presser foot up, turn the cloth, presser foot down, go right across through all the thickness. When I get to the edge, I back stitch, lock in the thread, and we're done. So this is the placket. As you can see, here's the little tab. Here's the tab, here's the stitch line, I'm just above it. I could have technically, if I wanted to, come down one more. That's okay. You just don't want to be on this side of the tab because then the placket will get all loose. So this placket is where the cuff is going to open up and where you can button the cuff together. So now that the placket is done, let's meld our stitches and then move on to the next step, which is attaching the sleeve to the shirt. Now both plackets are done, and I ironed both sleeves, and I brought this out again. Anytime you bring something out, it needs to be ironed again, for sure. So I ironed this as well. I have this laid out on the table to maybe offer you a tip. Anytime you're assembling a garment, always take the time to lay it out in an order that makes sense to you. I know that the plackets are always towards the back of the shirt. So I set up this shirt facing me, and then I make sure the placket is on that side towards the back of the shirt. That makes sense to me. It may not make sense to you, but setting up the arms this way, I never really pin them wrong. So when you're pinning, again, you always want to sew right sides together. So this is the front of the shirt, this is the part that we're going to see, that's called the right side. This is the right side of the sleeve, the part we're going to see. This front corner needs to match up with this corner. So what I do is I fold it over like this, and then I begin pinning from here all the way around. Now as you're pinning, you're going to have to ease the material. This part of the sleeve is a little bit larger than the hole, and there's a whole variety of reasons that we won't get into of why, but just trust me on that. So I start pinning here, I make sure that this is tight and this is a little scrunched as I go through the whole thing and make sure it lines up on the other side. Now let's pan in a little closer so we can pin together. So I've started pinning this one first to recap. I'm going to set the other sleeve aside a little bit. I'm going to work the shirt around so I can work with it better. So this is where I'm going to be pinning this sleeve. So one thing that helps me judge is I pin this corner over here. And then it should have some notches and things to line up. That will help you as you get started. So pin where the notches are, that'll help you also judge. But I try not to pull the sleeve tight. If there's any stretch, I make sure the stretch goes on where the sleeve is being received into the shoulder. And I pin pretty close, and I go nice and slow when I sew this seam. This is one of the tougher seams to sew. It's okay, I'll help you through it. I don't know if you can hear the ambulance in the background. There's an ambulance training facility near here, and they're not coming for me, trust me. Now that I've done a handful of pins on this side, I switch and do the other side, just to make sure it's coming in from either side evenly. This cotton muslin has a nice stretch to it, so should be pretty simple pinning this time around. That turned out to be a pretty simple pinning. Sometimes I end up with a little too much material, and what I do is I just take the pins out and ease that material back into where it might be a little tighter. Now, I often pin the sleeve on top of the shirt because that way it feeds into the machine with the sleeve on top, and then you can manipulate the cloth down below. Let me turn my machine on. I'll show you what I mean. Push over a bit. A couple stitches in to lock it in and get going. So I'm at my first pin. Keep my pins on the side here. I usually keep them right next to my machine. So when I remove my pin, I'm always checking underneath the cloth to make sure it's nice and smooth where my next segment of sewing is going to be. And my next pin comes out. Then need to make sure things are nice and smooth in this next segment. Something messed up with my bobbin. Let me fix the sewing machine and I'll be back. Machine situations occasionally happen. First step is don't freak out. Second step is to gently pull the cloth out from under the needle and gently loose up some of the thread so that it can come out and so that you can clip it free. Then you always rethread the top and reset your bobbin and check on a blank or scrap piece of fabric, and then come back to the original shirt once everything's a-okay. So I repinned. It wasn't very much that we had to repin and start over with. Let's do this again. Again, you're always checking underneath to make sure everything is smooth. If there's any wrinkle, you need to come back under and adjust it so there's no wrinkle where you're going to be stitching. handful of stitches. I'm stitching to the pin, pulling the pin out, resetting the cloth to make sure it's nice and straight. Takes a little while, it's a little bit tedious in that regard, but it makes it easy because then you only have one pass to do. Now when you're done, always take time to inspect and look at your seam to see if there are any wrinkles, crinkles, or things you need to redo. It's not a horrible thing if some wrinkle is in there and you need to rip out just a section and fill that section in. Remember, whenever you're filling in, you want to back stitch a little to the left of it, stitch over it, and then back stitch a little to the right of the space. This one wrinkled and crinkled a little bit, but it didn't catch in the seam. And if I pull it to the other side, it doesn't affect how the shoulder looks. So I'm going to keep it. So what I want to clarify what I mean by wrinkled and crinkled. This seam allowance wrinkled and crinkled down a little bit, but the stitch stayed the same, and when I pull it to the other side, there are no wrinkles or crinkles in the seam. Otherwise, if there were wrinkles and crinkles in the seam, I'd tear out that section and redo that section. Now we gotta clip the thread ends and hit the ironing. Then we'll come back to attach the side. So right now we have a flat sleeve. What we do is we pull it over together and then we stitch down the sleeve and down the side of the shirt to make that sleeve. See you after the ironing. Now the shirt is inside out, and I wanted to make sure to point out where I did some pinning. I did some pinning near the end here and near the end here, and I made sure to pin on either side of the seam to make sure the seam lines up perfectly, because you don't want that seam being all over the place when you're sewing. You want it to line up just perfect. So I'm going to start here and end here. Some people like to go the other direction. It doesn't much matter. And we go through like this. As you get closer to the armpit, if you will, you need to make sure the seam is laying how you want it to. I'm choosing to lay it all into the arm, and you want to make sure on the bottom that that's how it's going, and on the top that that's how it's going. If you want it towards the outside of the shirt, that's fine. If you want it flat open, that's okay too. Just make sure before the presser foot gets to it that you want it, that it's actually facing the way you want it. And you go right in. Pins come out. Now that we're at the end, you want to meld your stitch right along here, and then once you've melded that stitch on the iron, you make sure to inside it out, and then our next step is the cuff. So let me get the other sleeve on, and then we'll get the cuffs ready. Now the next part is cuffs. And there are two types of patterns with cuffs. One that take the two pieces of fabric and then you stitch them together around the edge and then that becomes your cuff. Or another type where you fold it in half and then you stitch the edges and that becomes the cuff. Now if you have the two pieces of fabric kind of cuff, I would recommend only one piece of interfacing. If you have one cuff piece, I would use the whole thing of interfacing. That way when it folds over, it's nice and stiff. So this pattern calls for one piece of fabric for the cuff and then it folds. So I'm going to attach the interfacing to the two cuff pieces. And when you attach interfacing, read the directions on the interfacing. This kind has little beads on it and you can feel the rough side. The rough side goes against your fabric. Then you line it up and you don't iron back and forth, you rest the iron on top and hold for about 5 seconds. Then you move it over. This way the iron will melt all of those bubbles of adhesive and fuse the interfacing to the fabric. Then I give it a gentle press to work out some of those iron marks. There we go. The interfacing is attached. Let's do the other one and I'll see you by the sewing machine. Now that I'm back at the sewing machine, I've marked my edges where this is going to fold over when I get back to the ironing board. And so I'm going to sew from this 5/8 mark all the way to the edge. This is my folded edge. Again, I did the folded cuffs on this pattern, so that's what I'm going to be demonstrating. Now on the folded over cuffs, I actually like to tie the folded edge in a little bit of a knot. I do it once, and I do it twice, and then I cut the threads on the folded side. Tie it once, tie it twice, and then I snip. Pull the pins out, and then cut the other thread ends. Now we want to trim these edges. I usually trim right at the edge with the pinking shears. Same with this side. Then after I do the pinking shears, I cut at an angle. Now I don't want to clip the threads at all, but I want to get as close as I can with this triangle. The reason you're doing this triangle is so when you inside it out, the cloth doesn't bunch up. After I cut that triangle, I then grade the seam allowances. Same thing over on the other side. Cut the triangle. Grade the seam allowances. Now we're going to press this side down like that, and then we're going to stitch this to the wrist of the shirt. So I'll hit the ironing board, and then I'll meet you back here for the shirt, attaching the cuff to the shirt. Now we're back from ironing. I've pressed this little bit down, melded my stitches to make sure everything's good. We want to inside this out. Now part of the trick with this, some people use scissors. I'm very cautious about using scissors because sometimes scissors can poke a hole in the fabric. I use a pencil, a marking pencil, that's very similar to the color of the fabric. I've used some gray ones sometimes and it comes through on the end product as gray. So white fabric, white pencil, and that helps me get a nice little end point that's nice and precise. And this cuff is a folded cuff, so I don't need to worry about pressing the seam so much. So now we stitch alongside here and attach it to the sleeve. So let me grab my shirt. We want to pin it and then get it ready for the machine. Now one thing that helps stitching is pulling this off. And the reason is, this is about the width, the circumference, the diameter, whatever it is, of the sleeve. So as you're stitching it, it curves around nicely. Whereas if you kept the attachment on, it couldn't work, but then you're fiddling with the sleeve a little more than you need to. Then I pull this back as I continue stitching so I don't catch it. Now that's stitched, you want to check both sides. Make sure it's nice and smooth. Everything's the way you want it. Looks good. So my next step is to grade these seams. So I snip the thread ends. And I clip the very edge with pinking shears. Then I cut the side with the interfacing a little closer. Interfacing adds some stability to the fabric, so if it's going to fray from the natural fabric side. If you did some fusible interfacing, you can cut a little closer with a straight edge and it won't fray. So that's why I cut that one a little bit closer. It's also a thicker consistency when you add that to the fabric. So I make that part smaller so it's not a harsh edge. Now you want to tuck this seam into the cuff. And one way I keep it there is I pin it every once in a while. Doesn't need to be a perfect pinning to hold it in absolutely strong, because the next step is going to help you a lot there. So I pin it just enough to keep it tucked in. Maybe 3 or 4 pins total. Now Now I'm going to bring the camera in a little closer to show you the next step. So I have my needle and thread. What I want to do is I want to tuck this knot away. So I remove the pin and I pull this back out a little bit. And right near the edge, stick the needle through. And see the knot is there. And I tuck this right back in. Sometimes I use my shears to get a nice neat tuck in. What we want to do from here is we want to pull right where this thread comes out. I'm going to clip the other thread because it's creating a confusing picture. That's a thread end right there. So right where the thread comes out and this top cuff lays on top of it, you want to stick your needle in, come out down a little ways, pull it through, then where this comes out up here, you want to go right next to the seam. Same sort of thing. Push it on through. And you follow this pattern all the way down. One thing you want to double check is when you're into this material right here, you want to make sure it does not come through to this side. It needs to be invisible on that side. So you continue down. A little bit of a stitch. You don't need to make super small stitches on this kind of seam. It's called a basting, which insinuates larger stitches. And you want to pull it tight, but not so that it's crinkling any of the material. Now that you got the general idea, I'm going to do all the rest of this length up until here, and when I get to the end, I'll be back. So I made it to near the end. As you can see, there are some little divots here and there that you can see because I'm using a contrasting thread, but mostly this is an invisible basting stitch. So I showed you how to hide the knot at the beginning. At the very end, again, let me clip these so you can see better. To finish off the end, I go right through the edge. And then I come back through the end to solidify this little last bit. Now that I'm in this bottom part, I then do another very small stitch and I don't pull it through all the way, only partially. And see how I have this loop? I pull it through the loop 1, 2, at least 3 times. I'm going to do longer for the purpose of this video just so you can see the effect of something else. So I'm going to do 7 just so you can see better. And then the last one, you just pull it through. What I do to hide this knotty part is I squeeze the needle between the 2 layers, and about a needle's length away I go back through the cuff and I pull the entirety of the whole chain of those little loops through. Then I scrunch the cuff down, and with it scrunched I clip as close as I can without cutting the fabric, and then I re-stretch it out and it all disappears. So the knot is then in there facing that way. The next step at this point is to do a top stitch around the whole edge. That way you can hold in this part of the cuff. So I'll back up so you can see the machine better. Now we're back at the machine. We can take either cuff. I'm going to start with the other side just because that's easier to demonstrate just for now. And you have this long piece, the big one that goes over, and then the smaller short one that goes under. I usually start with the one that goes under. Now the other side, I would do the same thing. It just adds a little awkward angle that you don't see as good on camera. So I put the fabric underneath. I don't start at the very edge, because if I started at the very edge, sometimes the material gets caught and you don't get a good start and it's frustrating. So I start just in a little bit from this tab, and I do an edge stitch as close as I can to the edge without going off maybe a 1/16 of an inch inside the edge. Because on the inside where you attach the cuff, it's a little higher. So if you do a 1/16 of an inch on the inside, on the outside it'll appear closer to an 1/8 of an inch. Couple stitches forward, couple stitches backward, and here we go. Now that I'm on my edge, you want to err a little bit on the side of safety and caution. Pivot a little bit early versus a little bit too late. Same thing when you get to this corner. Pivot a little too early instead of a little too late, but keep things going straight. Now that I'm on the edge, I come back around to do this last little bit. Back stitch over where you back stitched originally. You should be done. Notice with this, from a distance, it seems close to the edge, but it's not right on the edge. There's some distance, about an 1/8 of an inch all the way around. And see how there's an 1/8 of an inch on this side, even though on this side, I only made a 1/16 of an inch between the edge of the fabric. Now to do the other cuff off camera, and we'll be ready. I think someone shrunk my ironing board. No, just kidding. This is a sleeve ironing board. which is great for sleeves. Before you want to put the crease in there, it helps you get a little bit of the curve and some of that going. So I sort of let the pleat play out on its own. I don't really put a crease into the pleat quite yet. And we have sleeves. Ta-da! My name is Michael Lianos and this is Stitch in Time. I hope this video is helpful. Next one's going to be collar. See you then.